So what I really want to talk to you about today is to give you some of this historical context for two reasons. I mean, the first reason is a very practical reason, because all of you are guerrilla fighters in an ideological war. And when you go out and talk to your friends, and when you go home and talk to your parents, and when you go to talk to your parents' friends at the Christmas dinner table, and on and on and on, you have to be ready to counter some very simple lies, which have been repeated so often that they've become a kind of orthodoxy. But I also want to make a second point. Those of you here, you are now 18, 19, 20, 21, mid-20s at most. Now, you're going to be involved in struggles. If you are serious about this business, you're going to be involved in struggles not just over the next week, or over the next winter, or over the next year, but for the rest of your lives. Because the most important kinds of things which we are fighting to defend are the products of generations of human sacrifice, of generations of people who fought and demanded a different kind of social order. And the things, any kind of important social project which we're invested in, and I'm talking here about not just what we're fighting to defend, but perhaps what we are fighting for, about which I think we're not often sufficiently clear. It's not going to be something that's going to be achieved in 1 year or 5 years or 10 years. It's going to be achieved across the generations. So we need, in a sense, to make sense of where we are at this historical moment, the path through which we've come, the likely options ahead, the general structures within which we work. Now, I've begun here with this little slide. These are some categories. I just want to take a very quick census. Could you raise your hand if you understand what these things mean? Debt to GDP ratio. It's about price versus yield in bonds. Now, that's amazing. One person here understands how the bond market works, the inverse relationship between the price of debt and the amount it's yielding. Collateralized bond obligations, CBOs, credit default swaps. Now that's why we're all here. It's because of those two things. Those are the ultimate instrumental origins of the credit crunch. The money supply, that's a pretty simple one. Okay. Commodity versus asset inflation. Quantitative easing. The liquidity trap. The paradox of thrift. Okay, so we're going to kind of trot through a few macroeconomic ideas. This is kind of Keynes done in express line. So let's go to the next slide, please. 3 kinds of economic lies. I offer you here Mr. Clegg. Of course, I think it won't be long before the word Clegg begins to be used in everyday English as I told a Clegg. It begins, is it possible to be progressive when the public coffers are empty? He begins his paragraph. That is the framing sentence. Always watch how people frame a debate. Because when they frame a debate, they limit the kinds of outcomes and the kinds of discursive possibilities and outcomes. So, is it possibly progressive when the public coffers are empty? Well, fuck you, Mr. Clegg. The public coffers are not empty. That's the public service. So that is the first lie which is going around the world. That the public coffers are empty. This is a period of enormous austerity and shortage. We've got to cut back. We are living in the period of the greatest abundance the world has ever known. Partly because the Chinese state has brought the Industrial Revolution to China, and we now have far more capacity and product in almost every area of economic life than we've ever had. There's a lot of stuff out there. The question is how we share it. Secondly, the cuts to public services are necessary. And of course that follows partly on one, except of course there are other options than cuts to public services if the economic crisis was serious. Third, the cuts are the rational solution to a crisis. And that of course is something which I'm going to explore. Next slide. So here's a little map of debt to GDP ratio, because we were all told by the Conservatives and then latterly by the Condon government that Britain's debt to GDP debt was absolutely unbearable. Britain was about to kind of lurch over a kind of Argentinian or Brazilian default. Now this is a map of debt to GDP ratio. The GDP is the product of the country. It's kind of like the income of the country, however you calculate it. It's actually a bullshit statistic in some ways, but we'll use it. And measured against that is the amount of national debt. Again, that's a slightly kind of fudged statistic because what they do is they put a lot of debt off books. But anyway, if you look at Britain's national debt, the debt that has to be serviced by the state, it's actually relatively low in comparative terms across the G8. So you'll see that, for example, Japan, the real figure for Japan is about 230, 240%. So 2.5 times Japan's GDP is owed by the Japanese state in debt. Nobody says Japan has any kind of credit problem. The United States, Canada, France, Germany all have higher debt to GDP ratios than Britain. Next slide, please. This is a kind of graph of UK public debt since the national debt was invented at the end of the 17th century. And you will see, of course, that, well, the national debt has risen significantly in the last decade, in the last few years, as the state has essentially taken on the debts of private corporations. But in historic terms, it's actually not very high. In fact, for much of the 19th century, it was considerably higher, certainly for the 18th century and for much of the 20th. Next slide, please. Now, this is just coming down to the 20th century. You see that across in terms of the 20th century economy, again, not particularly high. If you compare it to other spikes and other economic crises, this is supposed to be one of the greatest economic crises since the Great Depression. Of course, public debt has to go up because the state is filling the space of failed private enterprise. Next slide. Now, this is the very interesting statistic. This is the key statistic. This is the one which you need to talk about to everyone. This graph tells you what is the percentage of Britain's GDP that is going to paying the servicing of debt. It is the relative relationship between interest payments paid on debt and the value of Britain's economy. And what you will note is that when Cameron and Osborne arrived in the Treasury in 2010, they enjoyed the lowest interest payments relative to GDP percentage of any Conservative Prime Minister since Lord Salisbury. But in fact, the actual figure is, it's significantly under 3% because money is cheap at the moment. And so that relative to the increasing public debt, it's actually quite easy to bear. They won't tell you that. Next slide, please. So why cut? What is their logic for cuts? It's important to understand what the logic of the other side is. Well, they argue, well, the debt burden is unbearably heavy. We know that's not true. They argue that it's leading to inefficient tax burdens. That essentially what we have is this public debt which is weighing heavily on the private sector. Another way of putting this is the argument that the state as an economic actor is crowding out private activity. Crowding out works in two ways. Either the state is employing so many workers that it's driving up the price of labor to intolerable levels and making business unprofitable. The other possibility is that the state is borrowing so much money from the gilt markets that it is soaking up capital which private enterprise use and making the cost higher. There is no evidence that either of these things is happening. First of all, we have extremely high levels of structural unemployment and underemployment. The headline unemployment rates tell us nothing, as you will know if you come from any community out of the southeast of England, or if you come from a poor community in the southeast of England, you will know that, in fact, levels of underemployment are extremely high. And this is true across the industrialized democracies. We're talking about real unemployment of 25 to 30%. We have a social problem, but it's a problem that has to do with the division of resources and also the organization of work and leisure. We put that aside for one moment. But there's no evidence of crowding out in the labor market, and certainly in terms of the capital markets, capital has never been cheaper. The fact that the banks are a bit squeamish about lending it is another question, but there's plenty of, this is not the fault of the state. There is lots of cheap money around. Well, cut is a symbolic political act. Well, this argument would be that, well, we don't really need to do it, but we need to give a signal to the bond markets that we're being responsible. Or we need to give a signal to our citizens that they need to live more austere lives. After all, the level of private indebtedness is really unsustainable. And of course, private indebtedness is the fault of people who really, they're just being spendthrift. It's not that their real wages have been frozen for about 20 years, and they've been compensating and subsidizing consumption with your support and encouragement by taking on private debt. No, it's their own personal fault. And of course, this guilt tripping is used to rationalize the cuts to the rest of the economy. As middle class people said, oh, well, yes, they will come out and they'll tell you of course, we have been living beyond our means. We do need to take cuts. And the application of the logic of the household is applied to the nation. But the real reason, I would think, is marketism. That what we have really entrenched since the 1970s and 80s is an ideological hostility to government and a faith that reducing government opens up space for the higher efficiency of the markets. What is really interesting to me about this condemned government is that it presents itself via things like its inclusion of openly gay ministers, its kind of touchy-feely soft surfaces, as being a kind of moderate, soft, conservative government. What it is, in fact, is the most extreme right-wing government in the West at the moment. And what they've done is they've gone to the policy supermarket of the American far right and brought these things into government while attaching to them this label of some kind of... And what they've done essentially is brought in, and this is true in terms of the recommendations which you'll know about, that the state involve McDonald's and Pepsi Cola and what's the big Diageo, the big drink company, into advising on alcohol and food policy. I mean, that's a classic sort of right-wing American idea which has been brought in. The privatization of schools, of education, healthcare. You know the whole package. But the argument from their side is that this opens up space for the higher efficiency of the markets. Well, the higher efficiency of the markets. We'll inquire into that. Next slide, please. Why not cut? Well, let's look at some real terms. Government is a critical actor in the modern economy. It employs 20 to 30% in some regions. If you go, for example, to the Northeast, you look at that Guardian map, which came out about 2 weeks ago, of the maps of public employment in Britain. That outside of the Southeast, the state is an absolutely central employer. And it's an employer of a certain kind. Well, when the private labour market has, over the last 30 years, turned more and more towards the introduction of forms of temporary labour, where workers have no job security, where workers have minimal pensions and social benefits, what the public sector has allowed is the provision of stability in employment, which has meant that in families in which one or two members are underemployed or not employed at all, that there has been one income to provide the capacity of people to buy clothes for their children, to buy books for their children, to provide the kind of, to buy fuel in the winter. And these are, the removal of state employment from 500,000 people as it's projected has got to have catastrophic consequences on social well-being, but also on the capacity of these people to consume. In purely economic terms, it is grossly irrational. It will lead to a shrinkage of the UK economy. There are some statistics which say that a £1 cut of government spending involves something like at least a £6 cut in the size of the UK economy. In other words, a small cut will have terrible consequences in terms of the actual fall, the deflation of the UK economy. And of course, since they're panicked about the debt to GDP ratio, it's going to look even worse because the debt stays the same, growing a bit with interest, but the GDP shrinks, which of course will then justify the next wave of cuts. Now, the fundamental Keynesian reason not to cut, and this is something which you will already have come across in one context or another, is the paradox of thrift. The paradox of thrift, those of you who've done 18th century papers 5 or 10 may have read Mandeville's Fable of the Bees, in which Mandeville discussed what would happen in the economy if actually you uprooted all spending. If everyone was virtuous and they saved, the economy essentially would grind to a halt. Now, next slide, please. Of course, this was explained to us by Vince Cable in April 2010, before the election, and I quote, "Cutting too soon and pushing the economy back into recession will make the deficit worse, as tax revenues receipts fall and benefits payments rise. The Conservatives' so-called efficiency savings are particularly dangerous. They have no clue where or how these efficiencies will be made, making it likely there'll be nothing more than a smokescreen for job cuts." Of course, you can turn to the Margaritaville episode of South Park for another kind of exposition of the paradox of thrift, which is the term which Keynes gave to it. Paradox of thrift essentially is if a state cuts its expenditure, what will happen is essentially the state's wealth will fall, not increase. It doesn't actually become